$7. That was all Dwayne Johnson had when his first dream died. Today, millions know him as The Rock, one of the highest-paid actors in the world, a global business powerhouse, a household name recognized across continents. But none of that existed when he sat alone, staring at a future that seemed to be collapsing faster than he could understand it. Most people know the famous story. They know about the $7. They know about the success. What they don't know is what happened in the space between those two realities. Because this is not a story about money. It is not even a story about fame. It is a story about identity. Long before Hollywood, before sold-out arenas, before billion-dollar franchises and worldwide recognition, Dwayne Johnson faced a question that destroys countless dreams every year. What happens when the one thing you built your life around suddenly disappears? At 23 years old, he believed football would be his future. Every sacrifice, every workout, every painful morning had been leading toward that goal. Then, almost overnight, it was gone. No spotlight, no backup plan, no guarantees, just disappointment, uncertainty, and $7. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. For Dwayne Johnson, it became the beginning of something far more difficult. Because losing money is painful. Losing a dream is devastating. But losing your sense of who you are can be unbearable. What followed was not a smooth rise to success. It was a series of setbacks, humiliations, risky decisions, and moments when failure seemed far more likely than victory. There were doors that never opened, crowds that rejected him, executives who doubted him, industries that tried to reshape him. And more than once, he found himself forced to start over from scratch. Yet each collapse revealed something that would eventually separate him from thousands of talented people who never reached the same heights. Not strength, not confidence, not even talent. Something far more valuable. In this documentary, we'll uncover the hidden turning points that transformed a struggling young man with $7 into one of the most influential figures on the planet. We'll explore the pressures he inherited, the mistakes he made, the risks he took, and the decisions that changed everything. And as this story unfolds, you may discover that the most important part of Dwayne Johnson's journey wasn't how he became successful. It was how he learned to keep moving forward when success seemed impossible. There are moments in life that arrive without warning and divide everything into two parts: before and after. For Dwayne Johnson, that moment came when the future he had spent years chasing suddenly vanished. Football was never just a sport to him. It was an escape route, a promise, a way out of the financial instability that had followed his family for years. Every practice, every injury, every sacrifice was connected to a vision he carried in his mind. One day, he would make it. One day, the struggle would finally end. By the time he reached college, that vision appeared to be coming true. Playing for the University of Miami, one of the most respected football programs in America, Dwayne found himself surrounded by elite athletes and future professionals. The path ahead seemed clear. If he worked hard enough, if he proved himself, the professional leagues would eventually come calling. But reality rarely follows the script we write for ourselves. A series of injuries began to interfere with his progress. Opportunities slipped away. Other players emerged. The future that once looked certain became increasingly fragile. Still, he refused to let go, because when you've invested years into a dream, abandoning it feels impossible. Then came the opportunity to play professionally in Canada. It wasn't the NFL. It wasn't the glamorous future he had imagined, but it was football. It was another chance, or so he believed. After joining the Calgary Stampeders, Dwayne arrived determined to prove that everyone who doubted him was wrong. He was willing to outwork anyone. He was willing to suffer. He was willing to do whatever was necessary. What he wasn't prepared for was how quickly everything would end. Only a short time later, he was cut from the team. Just like that. No dramatic farewell. No final opportunity. No heroic comeback. One decision. One conversation. And the dream that had defined his entire identity was over. Imagine dedicating years of your life to a single destination, only to discover that the road ends abruptly with nowhere left to go. That was the reality waiting for him. As he packed his belongings and prepared to leave, something far more painful than financial uncertainty began to emerge. For the first time, he wasn't asking how he would make money. He was asking who he was. The athlete was gone. The future he envisioned was gone. The certainty he relied upon was gone. And when he checked his pocket, he found a number so small it almost seemed symbolic: $7. That amount would later become famous around the world. But in that moment, it wasn't inspiring. It wasn't motivational. It was terrifying. Because $7 wasn't simply a reflection of his bank account. It was a reflection of how far he had fallen from the life he thought he was supposed to live. Yet hidden inside that humiliation was a truth that would shape everything that came next. For the first time in years, there was no plan to follow. No path already mapped out. No identity protecting him from uncertainty. Life had stripped everything away. And sometimes, that is exactly when a person discovers what they're really made of. What Dwayne Johnson didn't know as he walked away from football was that losing his first dream was about to force him toward a future far bigger than anything he had originally imagined. But first, he would have to confront a burden he had been carrying long before football ever entered his life. When people look at Dwayne Johnson today, it's easy to assume he was destined for success. The size, the confidence, the charisma, the family name. From a distance, his rise can appear almost inevitable. But the reality was far different. Long before the world knew him as The Rock, long before packed arenas and red carpets, Dwayne Johnson grew up in an environment defined by uncertainty. His story did not begin with privilege. It began with instability. As a child, he rarely experienced the kind of security most families take for granted. Home was not always a permanent place. Stability was not something he could depend on. His parents worked constantly to keep the family afloat, but financial struggles followed them wherever they went. The family moved again and again, different cities, different schools, different neighborhoods. Every move meant starting over. New classmates, new surroundings, new attempts to fit in. For a young boy trying to understand his place in the world, that constant disruption left a lasting impact. While other children built long-term friendships, Dwayne often found himself becoming the new kid all over again. And beneath the surface, the financial pressure was becoming impossible to ignore. There were times when the family had almost nothing. Times when bills piled up faster than they could be paid. Times when survival became the priority. One memory would stay with him forever. As a teenager, he came home and discovered something shocking. The family was being evicted. Not threatened, not warned, evicted. The apartment had been emptied. Their belongings were gone. The place they called home was no longer theirs. For many people, that kind of experience becomes a source of permanent fear. For Dwayne, it became something else, a promise, a silent commitment that one day he would never allow the people he loved to experience that feeling again. But at the time, he had no idea how he would fulfill that promise. He was just a teenager watching his parents fight battles they couldn't seem to win. The situation became even more difficult because of what was happening inside the household. His father, Rocky Johnson, was a respected professional wrestler. His mother, Ata Johnson, carried enormous strength, but the constant financial strain affected everyone. The family wasn't simply struggling economically. They were living under the emotional weight that financial instability creates. Stress became normal. Uncertainty became normal. Not knowing what would happen next became normal. Those experiences shaped the way Dwayne viewed the world. While other young people dreamed about luxury, he dreamed about security. While others chased recognition, he chased certainty. He wanted a life where the people he cared about would never have to wonder whether they could keep a roof over their heads. That desire became one of the strongest forces driving his future decisions. But growing up in instability also created another challenge. It left him searching for somewhere he truly belonged. A place where he could finally stop adapting. A place where he could build an identity strong enough to survive the chaos around him. Eventually, he thought he had found that place, not in wrestling, not in Hollywood, not in business, but on a football field. For the first time in his life, he believed he had discovered a path capable of changing everything. And that belief would soon become so powerful that he would stake his entire future on it. Most people assume that having a famous last name makes success easier. They imagined doors opening automatically, opportunities appearing effortlessly, a clear path already waiting to be followed. But for Dwayne Johnson, his family legacy was not simply an advantage, it was a burden. Long before he built his own reputation, his name already carried expectations that he never chose. His father, Rocky Johnson, had become one of the most recognizable wrestlers of his generation. His grandfather, Peter Maivia, was a respected figure in professional wrestling and deeply admired throughout the industry. Their accomplishments created a legacy that stretched across decades. To outsiders, it sounded impressive. To a young Dwayne Johnson, it often felt overwhelming, because every family legacy comes with an invisible question. Will you live up to it, or will you become the one who falls short? As he grew older, that question followed him everywhere. People saw the bloodline before they saw the person. They saw the family name before they saw his own ambitions. And while many expected him to naturally follow the path of wrestling, Dwayne wanted something different. He wanted to create a future that belonged entirely to him. Not because he rejected his family, not because he lacked respect for their accomplishments, but because he feared becoming a copy of someone else's story. Football offered an escape from that pressure. On the field, he wasn't Rocky Johnson's son. He wasn't Peter Maivia's grandson. He was simply another athlete competing for his own future. Every tackle, every practice, every victory, it belonged to him. For the first time, he could imagine building an identity separate from the expectations surrounding his family name. And that feeling became addictive. The harder he worked, the more convinced he became that football would allow him to write his own chapter. A chapter no one could compare to the generations before him. Yet something complicated was happening beneath the surface. The further he tried to run from his family's legacy, the more that legacy continued shaping him. The discipline he admired, the toughness he developed, the ability to perform under pressure, the willingness to entertain and connect with people. Many of those qualities had been quietly inherited long before he recognized them. Still, he resisted the idea of wrestling. To him, wrestling represented the past, football represented the future, and he poured everything into that future. Years of effort, years of sacrifice, years of belief. He became convinced that his destiny would be found on a football field, not inside a wrestling ring. But life has a strange way of bringing people back to the roads they never intended to travel. When his football dream collapsed, Dwayne suddenly found himself standing at a crossroads he had spent years trying to avoid. The identity he built around football was gone. The future he trusted was gone. And waiting in the distance was an industry he had never planned to enter. An industry connected to his family, an industry he thought he understood, an industry that was about to test him in ways football never could. What Dwayne didn't realize was that stepping toward wrestling would not feel like coming home. It would feel like walking directly into another battle, one that would force him to confront rejection on a scale he had never experienced before. There is a unique kind of pain that comes from losing a dream, not because the dream disappears overnight, but because you slowly realize that no amount of effort can bring it back. For Dwayne Johnson, football wasn't just a career choice. It had become the foundation of his future. Every major decision in his life had been connected to it. Every sacrifice carried the assumption that one day the reward would arrive. And for a while, that belief seemed justified. At the University of Miami, he was surrounded by elite athletes competing at the highest level of college football. The environment was intense, demanding, and unforgiving. But it was also exactly where he wanted to be. This was the proving ground. The place where professional careers were born. The place where dreams became reality. Like countless young athletes, Dwayne believed that if he worked hard enough, stayed disciplined enough, and sacrificed enough, success would eventually become unavoidable. It's a powerful belief, and sometimes a dangerous one, because life does not always reward effort the way we expect. As the seasons passed, injuries began interfering with his progress. Opportunities became harder to secure. Other players stepped forward. Competition intensified. None of this happened dramatically. There was no single moment when everything collapsed. Instead, the dream began slipping away inch by inch. And that's often the cruelest part. You can feel the future changing while still convincing yourself that everything will work out. You keep training. You keep believing. You keep telling yourself that one breakthrough can change everything. For Dwayne, that breakthrough never arrived. After college, his opportunity came through professional football in Canada. Joining the Calgary Stampeders offered one final chance to prove he belonged in the sport. One final chance to rescue the future he had spent years imagining. He arrived determined, hungry, focused, ready to earn his place. But reality had already begun moving in a different direction. The coaches made their evaluations. The roster decisions were finalized. And Dwayne Johnson found himself on the wrong side of those decisions. Released, cut, sent home. Just another player whose dream hadn't survived the process. For most people, that sentence sounds simple. He got cut from a team, but for him, it felt like something much larger. Because football had become more than a profession, it had become evidence that his struggles meant something. Evidence that the years of instability, sacrifice, and hardship were leading somewhere. When football disappeared, that meaning disappeared with it. Suddenly, he wasn't mourning a career. He was mourning an identity he had spent years constructing. And that created a problem few people around him could fully understand. What do you do when the future you've prepared for no longer exists? Most people never develop an answer because they never expect the question. Dwayne didn't have an answer either. Not yet. All he had was uncertainty. The certainty of sports had been replaced by the uncertainty of real life. No clear path, no guaranteed opportunity, no roadmap. Just the uncomfortable reality that he would have to start over. Again. And perhaps the most difficult part was accepting that starting over didn't feel heroic. It felt humiliating, it felt confusing, it felt unfair. Yet hidden inside that collapse was a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. Sometimes the dream that breaks your heart is the very thing preventing you from discovering the future you were actually meant to build. At the time, Dwayne Johnson couldn't see that. All he could see was failure. And as he entered one of the darkest periods of his life, another battle began to emerge. A battle no coach could solve, no teammate could fix, no paycheck could erase. It was the battle happening inside his own mind. Failure is visible. People can see when you lose a job. They can see when a business collapses. They can see when a dream falls apart. What they usually cannot see is what happens afterward, the silent conversations, the self-doubt, the questions that begin echoing inside your mind when nobody else is around. For Dwayne Johnson, the weeks following the collapse of his football career became one of the most difficult periods of his life. Not because he lacked money, not because he lacked opportunity, but because he no longer recognized the person staring back at him. For years, he had introduced himself to the world through football. His routines revolved around it. His goals revolved around it. His future revolved around it. Then suddenly, all of it disappeared. And without realizing it, he had fallen into a trap that affects countless ambitious people. He had attached his identity to a single outcome. As long as football existed, everything made sense. When football vanished, so did the certainty that had guided him. The problem wasn't finding another job. The problem was answering a much more uncomfortable question. Who are you when the thing you've dedicated your life to no longer exists? Most people avoid that question. Dwayne couldn't. Every morning forced him to confront it. The structure that once organized his life was gone. The discipline remained, but it no longer had a destination. The ambition remained, but it no longer had a target. For someone accustomed to constant movement, the uncertainty felt suffocating. And while the outside world saw an athlete whose career had stalled, a deeper struggle was taking place beneath the surface. He began questioning everything. Had all those years been wasted? Had he misunderstood his own potential? Had he simply not been good enough? Those questions can be dangerous because they don't attack your goals. They attack your sense of self. And when enough doubt accumulates, people often start lowering their expectations. They stop chasing ambitious futures. They begin settling for survival. For a period of time, Dwayne stood dangerously close to that edge. The confidence people associate with him today did not exist then. The certainty people admire did not exist then. What existed was confusion, frustration, and the uncomfortable realization that life wasn't following the plan. Yet something important happened during that period. For the first time, he was forced to separate achievement from identity. Football had taught him how to compete, but failure was teaching him how to adapt, and adaptation would eventually become one of the most valuable skills of his entire career. Because whether he realized it or not, the future waiting for him would require multiple reinventions. The athlete would become a wrestler. The wrestler would become an entertainer. The entertainer would become an actor. The actor would become an entrepreneur. And none of those transformations would have been possible if he remained attached to a single version of himself. At the time, however, that lesson was still hidden. All he knew was that he needed direction, some kind of opportunity, some kind of reason to believe that his story wasn't already over. That's when a familiar possibility began appearing in front of him. A possibility connected to his family. A possibility he had spent years avoiding. Professional wrestling. From a distance, it seemed like the obvious next step. But what looked obvious to everyone else felt deeply complicated to him, because stepping into wrestling would mean confronting a truth he had resisted for most of his life. The path he once viewed as an escape route from his family's legacy might be the very path that could save him. And what happened next would prove that entering the wrestling business was not the solution to his problems. It was the beginning of an entirely new set of challenges. By the time professional wrestling entered the conversation, Dwayne Johnson was in no position to be selective. The dream he had trusted was gone. The future he had planned was gone. And for the first time in years, he was searching for direction instead of chasing a destination. From the outside, the answer seemed obvious. His father had wrestled. His grandfather had wrestled. The industry already knew his family name. Why not follow the same path? But what looked like a natural transition to everyone else felt far more complicated from Dwayne's perspective. Because wrestling was never the life he envisioned for himself. For years, he had deliberately moved in the opposite direction. Football represented independence. Football represented a chance to build something entirely his own. Wrestling represented a return to expectations he had spent much of his life trying to escape. Accepting that reality wasn't easy. In many ways, stepping into wrestling felt less like pursuing a dream and more like admitting that his original plan had failed. And that distinction mattered. People often celebrate reinvention when it succeeds. What they rarely discuss is how uncomfortable reinvention feels in the beginning, especially when it forces you to confront your own pride. For Dwayne, joining the wrestling business required more than learning a new profession. It required abandoning the belief that success had to arrive in the form he originally imagined. That was the first challenge. The second challenge was discovering that family connections did not guarantee acceptance. Yes, people recognized his lineage. Yes, his last name opened conversations. But once he stepped into the ring, none of that protected him. Professional wrestling is a business built on performance, not promises, not bloodlines, not expectations. The audience decides whether you belong, and audiences can be brutally honest. Still, Dwayne committed himself fully. He trained relentlessly. He studied the craft. He learned the physical demands of performing night after night while traveling constantly from city to city. The lifestyle was exhausting. The learning curve was steep. Yet he embraced it because he understood something important. This was no longer about preserving pride. This was about creating opportunity. Eventually, the World Wrestling Federation gave him a chance. It should have been the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The beginning of a new chapter, the start of his comeback story. Instead, something unexpected happened. The audience rejected him, not quietly, not occasionally, repeatedly. The company introduced him as Rocky Maivia, a character designed to honor both sides of his wrestling family heritage. Executives believed fans would embrace him immediately. After all, he had the look, the athleticism, the pedigree, the story. On paper, everything made sense, but audiences don't respond to paper. They respond to authenticity, and something wasn't connecting. Night after night, the reactions became more negative. The cheers became boos. The excitement became frustration. The character wasn't working. And suddenly Dwayne Johnson found himself facing a painful possibility. What if his second chance was collapsing the same way his first one had? What if football wasn't the only dream that could fail? For many people, that level of rejection would have confirmed their worst fears. It would have validated every insecurity, every doubt, every reason to quit. But what happened next would become one of the most important turning points of his entire life. Because the audience's rejection wasn't actually destroying his future. It was stripping away a version of himself that was never real to begin with. And in the process, it was creating space for someone entirely different to emerge. Someone the world would eventually know by a very different name: The Rock. Most success stories focus on the moment everything finally worked. The breakthrough, the victory, the applause. But some of the most valuable lessons are hidden inside the moments when things fail for reasons nobody expects. Dwayne Johnson entered the wrestling world believing that effort would solve almost everything. It had always worked before. Work harder, train harder, prepare harder, outlast everyone else. That mindset had carried him through football, through adversity, and through years of uncertainty. But wrestling introduced a challenge unlike anything he had faced before. For the first time, hard work alone wasn't enough. The company presented him as Rocky Maivia, a smiling young hero designed to become the next fan favorite. The name itself honored his father, Rocky Johnson, and his grandfather, Peter Maivia. Executives saw it as the perfect tribute to wrestling royalty. On paper, it seemed brilliant: a talented young athlete, a respected family legacy, a bright future. Everything appeared perfectly constructed, and that was exactly the problem. The character was constructed. Fans could feel it. Every entrance, every interview, every scripted smile. The audience sensed that they were being told who Rocky Maivia was supposed to be instead of discovering who he actually was. At first, the reaction was mild. Then it became louder, then impossible to ignore. Crowds began chanting words no rising star wants to hear. Rocky sucks. The chants spread from arena to arena, week after week, city after city. The more the company pushed the character, the more fans rejected him. For Dwayne, the experience was devastating. He had already lived through the collapse of his football dream. Now his second opportunity appeared to be slipping away as well. And unlike football, this failure was public. Thousands of people were expressing their rejection in real time. Every appearance became a reminder that something wasn't working. The easy response would have been to blame the audience, to blame management, to blame circumstances. Many performers do exactly that. Dwayne chose a different path. Instead of asking why people disliked the character, he began asking a more uncomfortable question. What if they're right? What if the version of me they're seeing isn't real? That question changed everything. Because the audience wasn't rejecting Dwayne Johnson. They were rejecting a performance that lacked authenticity. The smiling hero wasn't connecting because it wasn't who he truly was. Behind the scenes, frustration had been building. The polished image didn't reflect the struggles he had lived through. It didn't reflect the anger, ambition, and resilience that had shaped his journey. The audience sensed the gap, and audiences are remarkably skilled at detecting when someone is pretending. Then came the turning point. Instead of fighting against the rejection, Dwayne leaned into it. He stopped trying to become the version others wanted. He began revealing parts of himself that had previously been hidden. The confidence became sharper. The humor became more natural. The attitude became bolder. The personality became real. Slowly, something extraordinary started happening. The same crowds that had booed him began paying attention. The same fans who rejected Rocky Maivia became fascinated by this new version emerging before their eyes. Not because he became more perfect, because he became more authentic. What the audience wanted was not another manufactured hero. They wanted someone who felt genuine, someone unpredictable, someone impossible to ignore. Without realizing it, Dwayne Johnson had stumbled upon a principle that would shape every stage of his future career. People connect with truth far more than they connect with perfection. The character called Rocky Maivia had failed. But from the ashes of that failure, something much more powerful was beginning to emerge. A persona that would eventually dominate wrestling, conquer Hollywood, and become a global brand. Yet before any of that happened, Dwayne still had to learn how to use criticism differently, because the rejection that nearly ended his career was about to become one of his greatest competitive advantages. Most people experience criticism as a signal to retreat, a warning, a reason to become more cautious, a reason to play smaller. When enough people tell you that you're not good enough, not talented enough, or not destined for success, the natural instinct is to protect yourself, to lower expectations before disappointment can hurt again. Dwayne Johnson had every reason to do exactly that. By this point, criticism had followed him through multiple chapters of his life. His football career ended with rejection. His transition into wrestling was met with skepticism. His early character was openly mocked by thousands of fans. At some stage, most people would have started questioning whether they were chasing something that simply wasn't meant for them. But something unusual began happening inside him. Instead of treating criticism as evidence that he should stop, he started treating it as information. That distinction changed everything, because criticism comes in different forms. Some criticism is noise, some criticism is jealousy. Some criticism is meaningless, but occasionally criticism reveals a blind spot, and those blind spots often contain opportunities. When fans rejected Rocky Maivia, Dwayne could have dismissed them as unfair. Instead, he listened, not to their insults, to the message hidden beneath them. The audience wasn't rejecting effort. The audience wasn't rejecting talent. The audience was rejecting a version of him that felt artificial. Once he understood that, the criticism became useful. It stopped being a personal attack. It became feedback. That mindset gave him a powerful advantage. While others spent energy defending themselves, he spent energy adapting. While others argued with reality, he studied it. And that ability to adapt would become one of the defining characteristics of his career. As his new persona evolved, so did his confidence. Not the confidence that comes from constant praise, the confidence that comes from surviving rejection. There is a significant difference. Praise can make people comfortable. Rejection forces people to grow. By embracing criticism instead of running from it, Dwayne began developing emotional resilience that would serve him long after wrestling. Every hostile crowd became training. Every negative reaction became preparation. Every setback became an opportunity to refine his approach. Gradually, the audience noticed. The energy shifted. The same fans who once chanted against him started repeating his catchphrases. The same arenas that once rejected him began erupting when his music played. But the most important transformation wasn't happening in front of the cameras. It was happening inside his mind. For the first time, Dwayne stopped depending on external approval to determine his value. He learned something that many successful people eventually discover. Public opinion changes constantly. If your confidence depends on applause, it disappears the moment the applause stops. Real confidence comes from trusting your ability to adapt, and adaptation had become his greatest strength. That lesson arrived at exactly the right time, because success was finally beginning to appear. The crowds were responding. His popularity was exploding. His name was becoming one of the biggest attractions in professional wrestling. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. Yet another challenge was waiting ahead. A challenge far more dangerous than criticism: success itself. Because once Dwayne Johnson reached the top of the wrestling world, he faced a decision that would have terrified most people. Stay where he was admired, or risk everything once again by stepping into an entirely different arena. An arena where nobody cared how famous he was. An arena where he would have to prove himself from the beginning all over again. Hollywood. By the late 1990s, something remarkable was happening. Dwayne Johnson was no longer fighting for attention. Attention was chasing him. The transformation seemed sudden to those watching from the outside. One year, he was struggling to win over wrestling audiences. The next, he was becoming one of the most recognizable figures in sports entertainment. But what looked like an overnight success was actually the result of a skill he had been developing without fully realizing it. The ability to become impossible to ignore. Most people assume visibility comes from talent alone. Talent helps, but history is filled with talented people the world forgot. What separates the unforgettable from everyone else is often something different: presence. Dwayne was beginning to understand that every arena, every interview, every television appearance represented a competition for attention, and attention is the most valuable currency in the world. When fans watched him, they didn't simply see an athlete. They felt energy, they felt unpredictability, they felt confidence. Even when they disagreed with him, they paid attention to him, and that was the key. Many performers try to avoid strong reactions. Dwayne learned how to create them. As the rock persona evolved, he developed a unique combination that was difficult to replicate. He could be intimidating and funny, confident and self-aware, aggressive and entertaining. That balance made him magnetic. Audiences never knew exactly what he would say next, and when people don't know what comes next, they keep watching. Soon, his interviews became events. His catchphrases spread through popular culture. Fans repeated his words in schools, workplaces, and homes across the country. The character had become larger than wrestling itself, yet something even more important was happening behind the scenes. Dwayne wasn't simply building popularity. He was building a personal brand before most people even used that term. Every appearance reinforced an identity. Every performance strengthened a reputation. Every interaction expanded his reach. Without consciously planning it, he was learning how influence works. And influence is far more powerful than fame. Fame makes people recognize your face. Influence makes people care what you do next. That distinction would later become critical, because industries change, platforms change, careers change. But influence can travel with you. As his popularity exploded, opportunities began appearing from outside wrestling. Television appearances, guest roles, media interviews. Hollywood executives started noticing him. At first, these opportunities seemed exciting. Validation that his hard work was paying off, proof that his audience extended beyond wrestling fans. But hidden beneath the excitement was a dangerous question. What happens when the stage that made you famous becomes too small for your ambitions? Most people spend their lives trying to reach the top. Very few are willing to leave once they get there, especially when success feels secure, especially when the audience already loves them, especially when failure could destroy everything they built. For Dwayne Johnson, that decision was approaching faster than anyone realized. Because while millions saw a wrestling superstar at the peak of his powers, he saw something else. A horizon, a possibility, a future that existed beyond the arena lights. The challenge was that pursuing it would require abandoning certainty once again. And if there was one lesson life had already taught him, it was this: every major transformation begins the moment you're willing to risk losing what you've already earned. The next decision would test that lesson more than anything before it, because Dwayne Johnson was about to walk away from the safest success he had ever known. Most people believe courage is what gets you to the top. In reality, reaching the top and staying there are often two very different challenges. The greater test comes when success finally arrives, when the applause is loud, when the money is flowing, when the risks that once seemed necessary suddenly feel unnecessary. That is the moment when many careers quietly begin their decline, not because people stop working, because they stop evolving. By the early 2000s, Dwayne Johnson had achieved something few performers in professional wrestling ever experience. He wasn't simply popular, he was essential. Audiences filled arenas to watch him. Television ratings soared when he appeared. Merchandise bearing his image sold across the world. The Rock had become one of the biggest attractions in the industry. From the outside, it looked like he had finally arrived. The years of struggle appeared to be over. The rejection that once threatened his future had been replaced by admiration. The uncertainty that once haunted him had been replaced by security. Most people would have protected that position at all costs. Dwayne started questioning it, not because he disliked wrestling, not because he was ungrateful, because he understood something many successful people learn too late. Nothing stays on top forever. Entertainment changes, audiences change, industries change, and eventually every dominant figure faces a choice: adapt willingly or be replaced. The wrestling business had taught him valuable lessons about attention, performance, and connection. But it also revealed something else. His audience was growing beyond the ring. More and more opportunities were emerging outside wrestling. Film producers were calling. Television executives were interested. Hollywood had begun paying attention. At first, those opportunities felt exciting. Then they became tempting. Eventually, they became impossible to ignore. But pursuing them meant confronting a frightening reality. In wrestling, he was already a star. In Hollywood, he would be a beginner. Again. The pattern was becoming familiar. Football had ended. Wrestling had required reinvention. Now success itself was demanding another transformation. The safer option was obvious. Stay where he was celebrated. Stay where he understood the rules. Stay where his reputation already existed. Yet Dwayne recognized a hidden danger in that approach: comfort. Comfort rarely feels dangerous when you're experiencing it. In fact, it often feels deserved. That's what makes it powerful, and what makes it dangerous. Because comfort has a way of convincing people that growth can wait until tomorrow, then next year, then someday. Until eventually, the opportunity disappears. Dwayne had spent enough time around athletes and entertainers to recognize the pattern. He had watched careers fade. He had watched people cling to past success. He had watched others stay too long in places that no longer challenged them. He refused to become one of them, so he made a decision that appeared irrational to many observers. He chose uncertainty over security, potential over predictability, growth over comfort. The move wasn't universally celebrated. Some people believed he was making a mistake. Others questioned whether wrestling stars could truly succeed in Hollywood. The skepticism was understandable. History wasn't exactly encouraging. Many wrestlers had attempted the transition. Very few had become major movie stars. The odds were not in his favor, and that was exactly what made the decision significant. Because true ambition rarely follows favorable odds. It moves toward possibility, even when certainty is unavailable. What Dwayne didn't know was that Hollywood would challenge him in ways wrestling never had. In wrestling, he had learned how to win over hostile crowds. In Hollywood, he would face something far more difficult: indifference. And before he could become one of the biggest stars in the film industry, he would discover that fame in one world means almost nothing in another. The climb was about to begin all over again. When Dwayne Johnson left the wrestling world to pursue Hollywood, many people assumed the hard part was already over. After all, he was famous. Millions recognized him. He had dominated one of the biggest entertainment platforms in the world. Surely success in movies would be a natural progression. Hollywood saw things differently. Inside the wrestling industry, Dwayne Johnson was The Rock. Inside Hollywood, he was simply another hopeful actor, trying to earn a place in a business filled with established stars. The difference was brutal. In wrestling, he walked into arenas and heard thousands of people cheering his name. In Hollywood, executives questioned whether audiences would ever take him seriously. Casting directors weren't looking for wrestling champions. They were looking for actors. And many believed those were two completely different things. The challenge wasn't gaining attention. The challenge was overcoming assumptions. People already had an opinion about him before he even entered the room. Some saw him as a wrestler pretending to be an actor. Others saw him as a novelty, a temporary attraction, someone whose popularity would fade once the spotlight shifted elsewhere. For Dwayne, this created a frustrating reality. He wasn't being evaluated solely on his abilities. He was being judged through the lens of expectations, and expectations can become invisible barriers. The early opportunities reflected that problem. Many of the roles offered to him were limited, predictable, and narrowly defined. Hollywood had already decided who it thought he should be: the large, muscular guy, the intimidating presence, the action character, nothing more. For a while, Dwayne accepted those opportunities because he understood something important. You cannot reshape an industry from the outside. You have to earn your position first. So he worked, movie after movie, project after project, learning the craft, studying the business, observing how films were made, watching how successful actors navigated their careers. The process was humbling. In wrestling, he had become an expert. In Hollywood, he was a student again, and students make mistakes. Some projects succeeded, others failed. Some performances received praise, others disappeared without making much impact. There was no clear upward trajectory, No guarantee that all the effort would eventually pay off. The uncertainty felt familiar. It reminded him of football. It reminded him of the early days of wrestling, another environment, another set of gatekeepers, another challenge requiring reinvention. Yet this time the criticism sounded different. People weren't saying he lacked charisma. People weren't questioning his work ethic. They were questioning whether he belonged. And belonging has always been one of the most difficult things to earn, especially in industries built around perception. Hollywood often rewards familiarity. Dwayne represented something unfamiliar, a wrestler trying to become a leading man. At the time, many believed that transition had limits. What happened next would challenge those assumptions completely, but not immediately. First, Dwayne had to confront another uncomfortable realization. The version of himself that succeeded in wrestling was not necessarily the version that would succeed in film. The confidence remained valuable. The discipline remained valuable. The resilience remained valuable. But the strategy needed to change. Once again, life was presenting the same lesson in a new form. Reinvention wasn't a one-time event. It was becoming a permanent requirement, and the next chapter of his journey would prove that lasting success belongs to those willing to rebuild themselves repeatedly, even after they have already achieved more than most people ever dream of. Most people assume reinvention happens once. You change your life. You overcome adversity, you achieve success, and then you finally get to enjoy the rewards. Dwayne Johnson was discovering a different reality. The higher you climb, the more often reinvention becomes necessary. By the time he established himself in Hollywood, he had already survived multiple transformations. He had rebuilt himself after football. He had rebuilt himself after the rejection of Rocky Mavia. Now he faced another challenge. The version of Dwayne Johnson that got him into Hollywood was not necessarily the version that would allow him to dominate it. That realization arrived gradually. At first, he followed the traditional path available to action stars. He accepted roles that emphasized his physical presence. Studios marketed him primarily as a larger-than-life figure. The formula seemed logical, yet something wasn't working. The films generated attention, but they weren't creating the kind of long-term trajectory he envisioned. He was succeeding, but he wasn't defining the future. And there is an important difference between those two things. Success often comes from fitting into existing systems. Dominance comes from reshaping them. Dwayne began looking at his career with a more strategic perspective. Instead of asking, "How do I get more roles?" he started asking, "How do I become irreplaceable?" That question changed everything, because becoming irreplaceable requires more than talent. It requires differentiation. Hollywood already had action stars. Hollywood already had charismatic actors. Hollywood already had celebrities. What it didn't have was someone who could combine multiple identities into a single brand. An athlete, an entertainer, an actor, a businessman, a storyteller, a public figure. Dwayne started building all of them simultaneously. His public image evolved, his interviews evolved, his social presence evolved. Even the way he approached projects began changing. He became increasingly selective about the opportunities he pursued, not because he wanted fewer opportunities, because he wanted the right opportunities. That shift required patience, and patience is difficult when you're ambitious. Many people chase immediate visibility. Dwayne started focusing on long-term positioning. Every decision became part of a larger picture. Every appearance strengthened a narrative. Every project served a purpose beyond short-term results. This wasn't merely career management, it was brand architecture. And while audiences saw a movie star gaining momentum, something much larger was being constructed behind the scenes. A platform, a reputation, a foundation capable of extending far beyond entertainment. The strategy worked. Film after film expanded his reach. Global audiences embraced him. Studios increasingly viewed him as a reliable force, capable of attracting viewers around the world. Yet, what made the transformation remarkable wasn't the success itself, it was the mindset behind it. Most people wait for circumstances to force change upon them. Dwayne had begun forcing change upon himself before circumstances demanded it. He wasn't reacting to decline, he was preparing for future growth. That proactive approach created a significant advantage. Because industries evolve quickly. Audience preferences shift, trends disappear, but individuals who continuously reinvent themselves remain relevant. And relevance, when sustained long enough, becomes influence. What Dwayne Johnson was building now wasn't simply a film career, it was something much bigger. Something that would eventually stretch into business, investments, partnerships, and global entrepreneurship. The actor was becoming something else, something far more powerful. A business empire disguised as a personal brand. And the next chapter would reveal how one of the world's most recognizable entertainers quietly developed the mindset of an entrepreneur. At a certain point, success creates a new problem. Time becomes limited. Energy becomes limited. And eventually, even the most successful career reaches a ceiling. Many celebrities never solve this problem. They continue trading their time for opportunities. A movie leads to another movie. An appearance leads to another appearance. Their income grows, but their influence remains tied to their presence. If they stop working, the machine slows down. Dwayne Johnson saw a different possibility. By now, he had spent decades studying industries built around attention. He understood how audiences behaved. He understood how trust was earned. Most importantly, he understood something many entertainers overlook. Attention is valuable, but ownership is priceless. That distinction would become one of the defining principles of his next transformation. For years, Dwayne had been the face of other people's companies, football teams, wrestling organizations, film studios, television networks. Those experiences taught him an important lesson. No matter how successful you become inside someone else's system, true leverage comes from creating systems of your own. And so, quietly, while the world focused on his movies, he began expanding into business. Not recklessly, not impulsively, strategically. Every move appeared connected to a larger vision. His partnerships became more selective. His investments became more intentional. His brand became increasingly integrated into the ventures he supported. The goal wasn't simply making money. Money was a result. The real objective was building assets capable of growing independently. This required a completely different mindset from entertainment. Actors focus on projects. Entrepreneurs focus on ecosystems. Actors think about the next role. Entrepreneurs think about long-term value creation. Dwayne was learning how to think in both worlds simultaneously. One of the reasons this transition succeeded was because he understood trust. By this stage, millions of people had followed his journey for years. They had watched him overcome setbacks. They had seen him evolve across multiple industries. Whether they admired him as an athlete, wrestler, or actor, many felt a genuine connection to his story. Trust had become one of his greatest assets. And unlike fame, trust compounds over time. Every promise kept strengthens it. Every authentic interaction deepens it. Every consistent action reinforces it. Dwayne leveraged that trust carefully. Rather than attaching his name to everything available, he focused on building ventures aligned with the reputation he had spent decades creating. Discipline, hard work, resilience, consistency. The same qualities that shaped his public image became the foundation of his business strategy. This approach produced something far more valuable than individual successes. It created diversification. Now his future was no longer dependent on a single industry. If entertainment changed, he had business interests. If trends shifted, he had investments. If one opportunity disappeared, others remained. It was the opposite of the situation he faced when football ended. Back then, his entire identity had been concentrated in one dream. Now he was building multiple engines of growth, multiple paths forward, multiple sources of opportunity. And perhaps without realizing it, he was fulfilling a promise made years earlier. The promise formed during moments of instability. The promise formed when financial uncertainty surrounded his family. The promise that one day he would create a level of security no setback could easily destroy. Yet despite the wealth, the fame, and the business success, there remained a question worth asking. Why do millions of people continue paying attention? Why has Dwayne Johnson remained relevant while countless other stars have faded from public consciousness? The answer has less to do with money, movies, or business, and far more to do with something increasingly rare in the modern world: trust. Because while success may attract attention, trust is what keeps it. Fame can make people visible. Success can make people admired. But trust is different. Trust cannot be purchased. It cannot be manufactured through advertising, and it certainly cannot be sustained through image alone. Yet somehow across multiple decades, multiple industries and multiple reinventions, Dwayne Johnson has managed to maintain something that many public figures lose the moment their circumstances change: credibility. This is especially remarkable when you consider the world he operates in. Entertainment is filled with short attention spans. Public opinion shifts quickly. Audiences build heroes one year and forget them the next. History is crowded with celebrities who achieved enormous success only to disappear from relevance once the spotlight moved elsewhere. Dwayne's story unfolded differently, not because he avoided mistakes, not because he never faced criticism, but because he consistently gave people access to the human being behind the success. Throughout his career, audiences watched him evolve. They witnessed the failures, the transitions, the risks, the setbacks, the victories. Nothing about the journey felt instantaneous, and that matters. People often distrust perfection because perfection feels distant. It feels constructed. What audiences connect with is progress. They connect with struggle. They connect with stories that reflect their own experiences. Dwayne understood this instinctively. Rather than presenting himself as someone who had always succeeded, he repeatedly shared the difficult chapters of his life. The $7, the failed football career, the rejection in wrestling, the uncertainty of Hollywood, the constant need to start over. These stories weren't weaknesses. They became bridges. They allowed millions of people to see pieces of themselves in his journey. And connection creates trust. Over time, another pattern emerged. His public message remained remarkably consistent. The industries changed, the projects changed, the opportunities changed. But certain themes never disappeared. Discipline, accountability, work ethic, resilience. Whether someone encountered him through wrestling, movies, interviews, social media, or business ventures, they encountered the same core values. Consistency is powerful because it reduces uncertainty. People begin to believe they know who you are. And when people believe they know who you are, trust becomes easier to build. Yet perhaps the most important reason for his lasting influence is something much simpler. He never stopped growing. Many successful individuals become trapped by the version of themselves that originally made them famous. They spend years protecting a reputation instead of evolving it. Dwayne chose a different path. He remained willing to adapt, willing to learn, willing to enter unfamiliar environments, willing to become a beginner again. Audiences respect that because life demands the same thing from them. Everyone faces transitions. Everyone faces uncertainty. Everyone eventually encounters situations where previous experience is no longer enough. When people look at Dwayne Johnson, they don't just see achievement, they see adaptation. They see proof that reinvention is possible. That lesson resonates far beyond entertainment. It resonates with anyone trying to build a better future, anyone recovering from failure, anyone starting over, anyone wondering whether their best opportunities have already passed them by. And perhaps that explains why his influence extends beyond movies, wrestling, or business. His story represents something universal, the belief that your circumstances do not have to define your destination. But as powerful as that lesson may be, it still leaves one final question. When we look back at the entire journey, from poverty to global success, from $7 to worldwide influence, what was the real story? Was it the money, the fame, the championships, the movies, or was something much deeper driving every transformation along the way? The answer lies in the final chapter. If you ask most people what they remember about Dwayne Johnson's journey, they will probably mention the same detail: $7. It has become one of the most famous symbols in modern success stories, a number repeated in interviews, articles, documentaries, and conversations around the world. And understandably so. The image is powerful. A young man with almost nothing to his name, eventually becoming one of the most successful entertainers and entrepreneurs on the planet. It feels like the perfect story. simple, memorable, inspiring. But if we've learned anything from this journey, it's that the most important truths are rarely found on the surface, because the $7 were never the real story. The money was simply evidence of a moment, a snapshot of where Dwayne Johnson happened to be, not who he was becoming. When people focus only on the number, they miss the deeper lesson hidden underneath it. The real story was never about financial poverty. It was about uncertainty. Again and again, life placed Dwayne in situations where the future became impossible to predict. Football disappeared. Wrestling nearly rejected him. Hollywood questioned him. Every chapter introduced a new form of instability, and each time he faced the same decision: retreat or adapt. Most people imagine success as a straight path, one opportunity leading neatly into another, one victory creating the next. Dwayne's story reveals something very different. Progress often emerges through disruption. Growth often arrives disguised as failure, and reinvention often begins at the exact moment when certainty disappears. That pattern followed him throughout his life. Whenever he became too attached to a single identity, circumstances forced him to evolve. The athlete became a performer. The performer became an actor. The actor became an entrepreneur. The entrepreneur became a global brand. None of those transformations were visible when he had $7 in his pocket. Yet the capacity to make them was already there. Not in his bank account, in his mindset. That is why the story continues to resonate with millions of people, because very few of us will become international celebrities. Very few of us will build billion-dollar brands. Very few of us will stand on movie sets or perform before sold-out arenas. But every single person will encounter uncertainty. Every single person will experience setbacks. Every single person will eventually reach a point where the path forward is unclear. And in those moments, Dwayne Johnson's journey offers something far more valuable than motivation. It offers perspective. The perspective that failure can be information, that rejection can be preparation, that starting over can become an advantage, that the end of one identity may be the beginning of another. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the defining characteristic of his life was never talent alone. It wasn't fame, it wasn't strength, it wasn't even ambition. It was adaptability, the willingness to keep evolving when evolution became uncomfortable, the willingness to remain a student after becoming successful, the willingness to risk today's certainty for tomorrow's possibility. That is what transformed $7 into a global legacy. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Your starting point matters far less than your response to it, because circumstances change, industries change, opportunities change, the future changes. But the ability to adapt, to learn, and to move forward despite uncertainty remains one of the most valuable assets any person can possess. Dwayne Johnson's story was never about escaping poverty. It was about refusing to be defined by any single chapter of his life. And that may be the reason millions continue to admire his journey. Not because of where he started, not because of where he ended, but because every time life forced him to begin again, he found the courage to write a bigger story than the one he originally imagined.